Hello, welcome to the post-workshop training session. My name is Julia Payne-Lewis, and I will be facilitating this pre-recorded webinar. Hello to all of you watching that I got to meet over this past year. It was an honor to get to know you, and especially at the May workshops. This past year, Measured Progress had the privilege to participate in many of these events. Thank you to all the Maryland educators that supported this important work. The materials, including videos, recorded webinars, PowerPoint slides, and handouts, will be available for your use. At the end of the webinar, we will share where you can find these materials. And as you can see on the slide, post-workshop webinar, this event, June 10th, is what we're doing today. This graphic is the big picture for the performance tasks. The end goal for Maryland educators is to have the performance tasks as a formative tool. In addition, this big picture produced a compendium of student work samples, which will be presented later in the webinar. As you can see on the graphic, the word administer is used, and administer can be a loaded term, but in this case, the word administer is synonymous with implement. The May workshops focused on formative assessment. The rubric sessions were focused on clear criteria for success. The feedback sessions were focused on how to provide students with formative feedback. The next slide is the analogy we used to support the formative nature of the workshops. This quote also is very critical in relationship to the descriptive feedback piece, which fits into the formative assessment world. So imagine that you are still working on the soup, on creating the soup. You're in your kitchen. How will you know when it's done? What criteria will you use to determine if it's ready to serve? When you taste the soup, using a clean spoon each time, of course, you're getting feedback about your cooking. That feedback gives you an idea if you've added too much hot pepper or if the soup needs spicing up. It helps to have clearly identified criteria or some idea of what your guests are expecting. That is where the use of rubrics comes in, and in this case it might also be the recipe or you tasting the soup, basing it on the criteria for what you like. Those two critical pieces of formative assessment were the focus for the May workshops: clear criteria and descriptive feedback. The distinct objectives of this workshop were twofold. We examined how rubrics can serve as a useful tool to determine the levels of student performance. We also practiced the art of providing meaningful formative feedback. Those things resulted in the compendium. For the purposes of the performance tasks, we focused on the formative use. The educators who created the materials that we will be sharing later in the webinar did not assign summative scores to the tasks. The levels assigned during the workshop model the idea that the tasks would be implemented in such a way that students would have opportunities to continue to work on the tasks after receiving descriptive feedback. The tasks could be used as a classroom activity with teachers right there to expand on learning, support students in their understanding, and provide verbal feedback as part of the experience. The verbal feedback is particularly important for the young children who would not be able to necessarily read the written descriptive feedback. One thing we wanted to mention about the rubrics was the feedback we received from Maryland educators. Many people liked the idea of using a holistic rubric that encompassed both reading and writing for the ELA tasks. That rubric is added to each grade level within the compendium, along with the rubric that came with the task. In math, grade level groups typically chose one standard and one math practice for the purposes of assessing student performance. Those areas that were evaluated are highlighted on the math rubrics within the compendium packets. Teachers can choose any or all of the parts of the rubric to focus on, depending on what supports the instruction that has been provided in the classroom. In addition, Maryland educators felt that using the number scores of 1, 2, and 3 should be substituted with the language emerging, approaching, meets, exceeds, and those terms are used for the purposes of a compendium. As stated, rubrics can be used both formatively and summatively. Here are some examples of how teachers and students can use rubrics formatively. For our purposes at the May workshops, we focused on the use of holistic rubrics. Even when the teachers used the analytic math rubrics that came with the math tasks, they used one section of the rubric as opposed to assigning several levels. We also introduced the idea that teachers may choose from a variety of rubrics depending on what the focus for learning is. You may have things that you use in your classroom like problem-solving rubrics or writing rubrics that you use that could also be applied to these tasks. If the students are working on reading skills, the criteria within the rubric should address those standards, for example. When drilling down to very specific skills, teachers may want to use one row within an analytic rubric. The point is that both kinds of rubrics are useful, and choosing the right rubric depends on the criteria for success that is chosen. When teachers develop a progression of learning within their lessons, they can also design rubrics to follow those progressions. This slide illustrates very simply what is important to know about both kinds of rubrics, and it works very well for visual learners like myself. Holistic rubrics examine student work as a whole, and analytic rubrics identify and examine components of student work. Using rubrics formatively to provide feedback supports instructional needs and promotes student learning. The slide shows a metaphor that really illustrates the importance of setting criteria for success. Not only does the rubric help to set the criteria, but providing teachers with actual examples of what the various levels might look like will help to define what meeting the standard is. Just like the paint chip, student exemplars can give everyone a better idea of what to aim for. For each step at the workshops, we had a process that we followed. Here are the steps that were taken during the first part of the workshops. Some groups were silent, and others were not so silent. Table groups decided what would work best for them, and that seemed to work well. And this process could be replicated at a school setting, all of these processes that we're going to be sharing. Another critical part of the work we did in May was that during all of the various activities and processes, we used specific ways that would be applying best practices during the work. The list is a really good reminder for whenever we look at student work from any activity. Once a set of exemplars for each task was chosen through the process on this slide, we then moved to providing examples of descriptive feedback. The emphasis on choosing the sets of work with assigned levels was really for a larger purpose, which was to create models of descriptive feedback for Maryland educators to refer to when they were providing descriptive feedback to their own students. The next few slides outline that process. These quotes speak for themselves. Take a minute and think about which one of them resonates best with your own experiences. Educators used a printed copy of this slide as they were writing the descriptive feedback, as a reminder about what could be included in their feedback. Not all feedback has to include comments from both areas. It's okay to choose acknowledging success or guiding future thinking, or maybe even both. One thing that is especially critical to focus feedback on is that students can use this feedback formatively, and they can take actionable steps once they get the feedback. If the student work is for evaluative purposes, it's fine to give evaluative feedback. Most likely the students will be finished with the task and not revisit it once they've gotten evaluative feedback. The performance tasks are meant for formative use, so the feedback is all based on what is actionable by students. Actionable feedback is given during the learning and when students can apply the feedback immediately. That is when the gaps in student understanding can most easily be closed. Many educators felt that this process was the most valuable part of their workshop experience. The descriptive feedback that was developed for the compendium was outstanding and provides teacher and student-friendly models for giving written or oral feedback to students. And in order to practice what we were talking about with our participants, each day we asked educators for information about what they learned, the discoveries they made, and any aha moments they had. You will notice that the last bullet is formative assessment is not summative assessment. This sounds like a simple concept, but it does take time to process how the two types of assessments are implemented in very different ways. In order to highlight the differences, the next slide tells the formative story. So take a couple of minutes to read through this slide and think about how is this scenario different from a summative or evaluative assessment scenario. A lot of learning happened during the workshops, but another major benefit was the compendium of student work that was built by Maryland educators. Table groups worked together to choose student examples from each level on the rubric, and they wrote annotations for the levels and gave each of the students descriptive feedback. The next few slides show some examples from the math compendium. By the time you view this webinar, or shortly after, you will be able to download both the math and ELA compendiums of student work. Each set of work is designed to provide all of the information needed to interpret the work. Grade level, standards, and other task information is included. Many teacher groups provided helpful notes for other educators as to how to use the task, as well as criteria to keep in mind during task administration or implementation. The rubrics and how they were used to examine student work are also included. The assigned levels and annotations for why the levels were chosen are given. They're shown in pink, and the descriptive feedback that the educators composed for students is shown in purple. Each student work sample is assigned a student number, student 1, student 2, student 3, etc. Here is an example of the student work that corresponds with the annotations and descriptive feedback from the previous slide. This is student 5. I'm going to return to the previous slide now that you've had a chance to see the student work. Here are some of the ideas for using the compendium. You may think of other ideas that are not included here. The student work compendium will be located under the range finding link on the FAME blog. The link is msde-fame.blogspot.com. We will leave you with this quote, as powerful today as it was over a decade ago. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope our paths will cross again at some point. Thank you so much.